age male, and you see this, you know, an older woman working in the fields too, and she basically takes you on like one of her own. You might call her mother, or you might call her aunt so-and-so, like, oh, that's my aunt. But is that really their aunt biologically? No, but it's a way of survival, okay? Okay, and then also, this is, okay, Kinsey, here's where I'm getting to this blank, okay? It was very common when slaves would get married, instead of saying till death do you part, it's kind of sad, they actually added to death or distance do you part, meaning the chances of breaking, being physically torn away were high. Okay. We know that slaves will be rented out. Sometimes they're rented out to like work in factories, and that's going to be pretty problematic because over time, if a slave, let's say, is working in a factory for a month, they're working next to white men, and they start to view themselves as a little more equal and stuff, and that really troubled slave owners. There were some awkward times when these slaves who were rented out will come back to work on the plantations, and like they're starting to negotiate and stuff, and it's like, no, that's not how it works. So, but just note that's kind of awkward. Just remember that except those slave codes will make it to where you cannot teach them how to read or write, so that a lot of them will be illiterate. But one thing that they'll do is that they'll create their own type of language called pidgin language, and I'll show you that in a second. But also music. So they will develop the banjo and would sing spirituals, hymns, as a way of coping. And sometimes, the spirituals would have a double meaning. Like if the Underground Railroad was supposed to leave at night singing like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and some other ones was that was the note that meant like, hey, we're leaving tonight kind of thing. Okay. All right, so look here, you have the free blacks, okay, starting like Washington's presidency up to the beginning of like the Civil War time. You can see that there are free blacks in certain areas, okay, who were not slaves, okay, but they were not equal. Even though they weren't a slave, a lot of them did not have any rights, okay, like the right to own property in some places, the right to testify. So if someone accused an African-American male of violating a law, they could not defend themselves in court and were automatically found guilty. Okay. In some places, they would actually eventually, later, before the Civil War, in some places in the South, they actually will be banned. Like free blacks are not allowed in certain areas in the South, like cannot be allowed in certain states. Okay, so just note, it was a lot. And just because there's not much slavery up north does not mean it's all sunshine and rainbows. There still was a lot of discrimination for free blacks. Okay. Yes, that's it with that. Okay, slave rebellions in the Old South. We talked about this. Remember, there's the Haitian Rebellion that happened like in 1800-ish. And that's going to really influence other rebellions. You had Prosser's Rebellion and Vesey's Rebellion during the antebellum times. Again, nothing ever really happened because in both of those, the plans were leaked out. Okay. Remember I told you the AME church that Richard Allen will form? That will be like a meeting place for a lot of these slave rebellions. And remember I told you eventually when you had that modern civil rights movement with MLK, they meet in churches because that's what slaves were doing. Free blacks and stuff were doing when they had meetings. They would meet in their church because they felt safe there. Okay. Escape from slavery. Just note that there is the Underground Railroad. You are familiar with Harriet Tubman. She will replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill in a couple of years. What's interesting about her is that she was a slave and she had an injury, but she was very, very strong. And she will lead at least 19 round trips from the South to Canada, okay? And, you know, lots of people will get their freedom because of her. But it definitely was, you know, I think it was around 400 total. But, you know, the Underground Railroad, it was kind of like you had checkpoints. You would escape and, like, you'd be on the run nocturnally. And, you know, on the way to Canada, you'd go through Pennsylvania. Well, who lives in Pennsylvania? The Quakers, okay? And Quakers definitely, you know, believe in equality and stuff, and they would actually help, like, harbor fugitive slaves. Like, they would have, like, little cupboards and secret things, even the floorboards. They basically, you'd find this, you know, this house with 2 lanterns on this side of the house, and it, like, here's the safe house, and you would hide there during the day. Then at night, you'd be on the run to the next thing, okay? So she orchestrated that, and really, and what's cool is she did 19 round trips with a $40,000 bounty on her head, meaning dead or alive, if you got her, you got 40 grand. And that was a lot back then, and she never was caught. So that's pretty cool. Why, you know, she's worthy of being on the $20 bill. Okay. Okay, so African American culture. Okay, we talked about this, the pidgin. Okay, that is a dialect. A dialect. Okay, for instance, there's lots of different African languages and all that kind of stuff, and so they kind of created their own. And so, like, the word banjo is actually a pidgin language. For peanut, it was called a gobber. Okay, but it's just the idea of coping, and it's the idea that even though you think the slave owners control everything about slaves, they actually had some autonomy, some, you know, of their culture preserved. Okay, the African American religion, there will be like a mixture, especially like in Louisiana, you'll have voodoo. That is another way of, like, preserving their culture. Okay, and then with Black music and dance, remember I told you the spirituals, the banjos, they also would have these particular, like, drum beats that they would use as well. Okay. So for religion, you can put things like voodoo. That's one example. Okay, so you can see while the slaves were controlled, they do have contributions to America that you wouldn't think of, like the banjo and like those slave spirituals that they'll come up with. Eventually, will make its way into like blues and jazz in the 1920s. It's derived from old slave spirituals and drum beats. Okay, so now what we're going to do, okay, is it's about the pro-slavery argument, okay, and a couple things that go up north, I mean not north, but up to the top of your page for pro-slavery argument. John C. Calhoun, remember he's the one that said slavery is a positive good, okay. There's another guy named George Fitz. You just write his name down, and it's and he basically believes that, you know, it's like, okay, South, like, or it's like Northerners, you're criticizing abolitionists. You're saying slavery's bad. Well, you basically have wage slaves. Those Irish immigrants working in the factories, you're basically paying them hardly anything, but they're wage slaves. So he's one of those that's like, hey, stay in your lane, North. You got problems too. You basically don't treat those Irish immigrants like humans either. They're wage slaves, okay? And then you have a guy named James Henry Hammond, and I am not related to him, okay? And he, I believe, is in South Carolina, and he definitely think there's, like, you know, there is a pecking order. There is almost like a caste system, if you will, that hierarchy, okay, that slaves are biologically, mentally inferior, all that kind of stuff, and thus there are certain tasks they're supposed to do. That's James Henry Hammond speaking, okay? And, you know, there's some people who say, hey, the Bible says, you know, masters, you be submissive to your masters, slaves, all that kind of stuff, okay? So what you're going to do, and this is a group thing, okay, and this should not take too long to do, but you are going to, I'm going to post something. you're going to be responsible for one document. Okay, I'll just tell you the number, what you'll do. Okay, and from that document, there is a HIP chart I created. Fill it out. It's very self-explanatory. Okay, and then from that, one person needs to post a Padlet, and that's self-explanatory. It sounds like a lot, but I guarantee you it's not. It's one document. You fill out the chart, and then when you're finished with the chart, someone posts a Padlet. Okay, so let me tell you what numbers you have. Okay, Alex Houston's group, you'll be document 1. Okay, Alyssa's group, Alyssa A, like Tommy and Crystalline, you're on document 2. Alyssa Cody group, you're doc 3. Christine's group, doc 4. Connor, doc 5. Anaya, doc 6. Kenzie, doc 7. And actually, Kenzie and Kyla, can y'all work together on this? Kenzie and Kyla, y'all both be doc 7, like y'all can work together. Molly, doc 8. Okay, and I know I missed one group. Which group did I miss? Okay, Kasia, then y'all will be doc 9. Okay, so now let me I'm posting it now. And just so you know, these are different interpretations about slavery. Some people are clearly abolitionists. They oppose slavery. Some people clearly support slavery. Okay? And once you finish with that, you are good to, and you can even log off now if you want to, but that's it for today.